Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to show you how to create a custom hook for fetching data from an API and displaying it on the screen. I'm also going to go over how you can run side effects when the query is fetched, like on success or on error. So be sure to stick around to the end of the video to see those. I also wanted to mention that only 3% of my viewers are subscribed. So if you've been enjoying the content, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a video. And without further ado, let's get into the code. So I just have a basic app here, which has a Chakra provider and then a container for the whole app just for styling purposes. And I have one route defined, and that's this post component. So if I open this up, you'll see that I just have some state here that manages the post coming in, the loading and error states. And right when the component renders, it's going to run this function, which sets the loading state to true, fetches this API and gets back a response, and then sets our post to the response data. If there's an error, I'm catching it and then setting the error state to true. And then finally, I'm setting the loading state to false. Then down in the component, I have the heading, and if it's loading, I'll output the circular progress, which is like a loading spinner. If there's an error, I just output an error message here. And if the posts exist, meaning they were fetched and set in the state, then I'm just outputting a stack here and then mapping through each post, getting the ID, title, and body, and then displaying those in the card. I also have this button that will navigate the user to /post/ID/edit, and we'll be creating that route later. So this is a pretty simple component, and when we go back to the page, you can see I just refresh, it fetches the data and then sets the cards. Now, the way that we currently fetch these posts is not good for a number of reasons. One is that it's not reusable at all. So if we ever needed to fetch these posts in other parts of the app, then we're basically just going to take this whole chunk of code and copy and paste it into every spot that we need it. And if something were to change, like the path of the endpoint, for example, we'd have to go back and find every spot that we use this and then change that. So it's incredibly inefficient. It's also super verbose. All of this logic takes up quite a bit of room, and if we had other pieces of state or any functions we define in the component, this file will start to get very long and hard to maintain. So instead, what we want to do is create a hook that will wrap all of this logic into its own component, and then we just want to be able to call the hook at the top level, like useQuery, and then this hook will return the data, the loading and error states, and any extra info we want to return. So this will be a much cleaner way to fetch the data, and we'll be able to reuse this hook everywhere that we need to. And if we ever need to change something about the logic or the endpoint, we would just change it in the one file where all this logic lives. So let's go ahead and create that file. We'll go into hooks and call it useQuery. And then I'm just going to copy and paste the logic we had from before. So let's come down here and create a constant called useQuery. And this is going to be a function. And inside is where we're going to define our state and the fetch function. So let's begin by creating our query state. And our initial state is just going to be an object instead of the three pieces of state that we had before, which are these three things: post, loading, and error. We'll just get rid of that, and we're going to store all of that state in an object, and we don't need this navigate here. And I'm just going to paste in these properties. So data is loading, is success, is error, and then the error message that occurred. Now let's come up here and grab the state that is returned. So we'll do state and set state, and then we need to replace all of these old functions with the new set state function. And instead of passing a value for the new state, we need to pass a function, grab the previous state, and return a new object. And we want to spread that previous state across, and then we want to override the isLoading property, and we'll set that to true. And then we need to do this for all the other functions. So if it was successful, then we'll pass in this function, and then we want to set the data property. We'll set that to response.data. We want to set isLoading to false. We want to set isError to false as well, if it was previously true, and then also the error to an empty string. And then we'll pretty much do the same thing for the error handler here. Except we'll set data to null, is loading can stay false, is error will now be true. And the error can be the error.message, or if that doesn't exist, we'll just add a default value like failed to fetch. And then we could get rid of this finally block since we're setting the loading states here. Now we just need to come down to the end of the file and return the state. So now this state, which is this object here, will be returned from the useQuery hook. So now we can just call this in our post component and we'll get access to all these properties. And this component will take care of all this logic for setting the state, fetching the data, and updating the state. We just need to come down and export it before we can use it. And then we'll come into posts and destructure the properties it returns. So we'll call useQuery. Then we're going to get our data is loading, and we'll just do is error. And we can rename data to something more specific like posts. And then we need to change out these names for the new properties. So is loading and is error. And if we hit save and just make sure we're importing everything we need in this file to useEffect and Axios. And then we also want to make sure we return the state outside of this useEffect, because this was nested inside this function. So we just want to make sure it's at the top level at the component. So if we hit save now and load our app, we should see that those posts come back and it's working just as it did before. So although this works, this is still not very good because it's not really reusable. We have this URL hard-coded, and although we could call useQuery and get the posts everywhere in our app, what if we wanted to get users or another piece of data? To improve this, we could take in a URL here as a parameter and then pass that in here and make it more dynamic in that way. But still, that's very repetitive because if we had the same post URL, we would have to pass that in every single time in every place that we use this. Instead, to get ultimate reusability, we're going to just pass in a function, and that function is going to take care of fetching data from the API and returning the response. And then all we need to do is call useQuery and pass in an API getter function. And then this hook will take that function, run it in the useEffect, and then update this state accordingly. Let's create that API getter function. If you open up the api.js, you'll see that I'm initializing an Axios client with this base URL. And now I could use this API variable to call the different methods from Axios, like get, post, delete, and it will have this URL set already. So we would just have to pass in the path that we need. Let's come down and declare a constant called getPosts. It's going to be equal to a function that is going to call api.get. We just need to tack on /posts. And then we're going to grab the promise here and get the response. And then we'll just return the response.data. So just like we were before. And we need to add a const here. And now getPosts is going to be a function that runs api.get and then just returns the response data. And we could just destructure data here and return that. So now we can go ahead and pass this function into useQuery. So we'll come in here, paste it, and import it. And now in useQuery, we need to grab the function that was passed. So we'll just call it fn. And down in the useEffect, instead of doing this Axios call, we want to just call the function that was passed. And before we call it, we want to make sure that there was actually a function that was passed. So we'll just do a quick check here. So if there's no function, just return out. So then when we get to here, we know that a function was passed. And then we're getting the response as a parameter, but we no longer need to do response.data anymore because in the function that we're creating, we're destructuring the data and returning it. So if it makes it any easier to see, I'll just split the tab and show you what's going on. So when we call this function here, we run getPosts, and getPosts will go to the API, fetch it at /posts, and then get the response, destructure the data, and return the data. So then this return value is the parameter here. So we're waiting for this promise to resolve, and then we call .then, get this response, which is this data that we returned, and then we're just setting the data state. So let's just change this to data, and we could remove this. So now we never have to worry about accessing the data prop or any other custom property that an API may return, all we have to do is make sure that from these functions, we return the exact data that we want to be set in this data property. So now if we hit save, we should see the post coming up, and it still works. And just to clean this up a bit, I'm going to take all of this in the function and just declare it above. So we'll do const run query is equal to this function, and we'll keep the logic the same, and then we'll just pass in run query here. So it just cleans it up a little bit and is easier to see. And this should still work as before. And we could test the error handling by just trying to access a post that doesn't exist. And you can see it says failed to fetch post. So our error handling is working. Now the next thing I want to do is return a refetch function. So if this data ever becomes stale or we want to give the user the ability to just refetch it, they should be able to just click a button. We can just come down here and return an object, and we'll spread the state out so they can access the same properties, but then we'll also return a refetch function. And this refetch is going to be equal to run query. So when the user calls refetch from whatever component they're in, then it's just going to go ahead and run this query, which will again check for the function and do all the same logic. So now we should be able to come back into posts and destructure refetch. And now we could create a button at the top that will call that function. Let's come up to this loading state and we'll turn this into a ternary. So we'll check if isLoading is true, we'll output this. Otherwise, we want to output a button. And in here, we'll just call it refetch, and then we'll add an onClick handler and set it equal to refetch. This is the function that was returned from useQuery. And then I'm just going to paste in some styles. And if we hit save, we should be able to see that button. And once we click it, it'll refetch. Now let's work on this edit endpoint, because when we click edit, it takes us to /post/id/edit, but we don't have a component yet that handles that route. So let's come into the app and create another route. And we'll do /posts/id and then /edit. And then we'll call this edit post. And we need to create this file. So we'll go into components and call this edit post. And let's start building out the logic here. The way that this is going to work is when we go to edit, we need to grab this ID that was passed and then fetch the post by ID and set it in local state. Since we're going to be editing the post, we want to set that post to state instead of just having it in a query like this, because we can't update this. So let's start off by grabbing the ID, and we get that from useParams. And that comes from React Router, and it returns an object with all the dynamic parameters we defined. So since we called this ID, we can destructure it here. And now let's create some state for our post. We'll do const post and set post. And by default, it's just going to be an empty object. Now let's bring in our useQuery hook. And again, we need to pass in a function as a parameter, and we need to first create that function. So we'll just copy this and do get post by ID. It's going to take in an ID, and then we'll turn these into template strings so that we can pass dynamic values. So we'll do /post/ID. And by doing this $sign curly braces, we could pass in any variable into the string. So now we can go ahead, grab this, and pass it into useQuery. Since this function takes a parameter, we can't just call it like this and pass in whatever ID, but we could just turn this into a little wrapper function. So we'll just do an arrow function here and call getPostById, and then we'll pass in the ID that we got from useParams. And here we get the same properties returned, so I'll just copy these over. This is no longer going to be posts, but it's going to be initial post. So this will be the initial post that comes back from the API. And since this is an edit route, we want to be able to update the post. So this will be the initial post, but then the post that we're going to be updating is going to be this post in the local state. So we need to figure out a way to set this post in local state once this query finishes. As I mentioned earlier, we can run side effects for when queries finish. And what we want to do is once this is done, we want to run an onSuccess function that will take the results of the query and then run setPost to then set it in local state. And then we could use it in our component. So let's update this hook to now take those side effect functions. Now we could take in a second parameter, which will be a config object. And here is where the user can define certain side effects like onSuccess or onError. And if they don't pass anything in, we can just default it to a default config. So let's just create that up here. We'll do default config. This is going to be an object, and we'll do onSuccess. And we'll just set it to an arrow function that does nothing. And we'll actually store this in a constant above because we're going to reuse that. We'll call it noop. Now we could just pass this variable in here, and we'll define an onError handler as well. So now the default config, if the user doesn't pass anything in as the second parameter, it'll just be this object that has these properties and runs a function that does nothing. So it's not going to have any side effects. Now we could come down here, and in our query, if it was successful, then we set our state, and right after, we'll just run the onSuccess. And we need to destructure this first from the config. So we could just do const and take these two properties. And we get that from the config that was passed in. And then for any errors that were caught, we'll set the state again and then just call onError. And we also want to pass in the data that was returned from the API to both of these functions. And now, since we're passing it in and calling onSuccess, we can come back here and define an onSuccess handler. And this will be a function. And again, we get the data, which is what we return here. We pass it in as a parameter. And we just want to run a function that calls setPost to the data that was sent. And this needs to be a comma. And now when the post loads in, it should run this function and set that post. And I'll just log the post real quick and we can see if it works. Let's just import edit post. And this actually has to be a JSX file since I'm using Vite. And we'll change useQuery as well. Now if we go back to our app, we should see that post being fetched. And there it is. Now let's focus on building out this edit post component. First, we're going to output a box here with some styles. Then we'll add a button here that is going to have an on-click handler that will just navigate back to the post page. And we'll add a card here, and inside we'll render a box. And we'll check the loading state and output some text. We'll also get the error state. And then we want to check if the query was successful. And if it was, we want to output this stack here. And in the stack, we'll display the title of the post and then an input to update it. And this value is going to be coming from the title that's stored in our state. And we also want to grab the body, and this will be a text area that is also hooked up to the state. And it'll just call this handle change function, which will take care of updating the state and the necessary properties. So now let's create this handle change function to update our state. Let's come up here and do const handle change. It's going to be equal to a function, and it's going to take in the event, and we're just going to destructure the target. And this function is just going to call setPost. And in here, we're going to pass in a function again. So we'll get the previous state, and then we'll return a new object. We'll spread the previous state out. And then the property we want to override is the target name. And if you look back at our inputs, you could see for the title input, we put the name as title. And for the body one, we have body. So we have access to this name attribute on the target. So we could open up square brackets and do target.name, and that'll be the property. And then the value we want to set it is to the target.value. And now on every onChange event, we're going to destructure the target and update the state based on the name of the input that triggered the event, and we'll set it to the value. And then the value of these are body and title, and we need to get those from our state. So we can do const title and body, and that will come from post. And then in here, instead of getting isError, we want to just grab the error itself because that's what we're displaying down here. So that would be the error message. And in order to use this navigate function, we need to call the useNavigate hook, which comes from React Router. So we can do const navigate equals useNavigate. And if we save this, we should be able to see that post and be able to edit it. And isSuccess is not defined. So we just need to pull that from here. And we don't see our card here. And that's because we need to set isSuccess to true here. And we also need to add it to this error handler, and we'll set it to false down here. Now if we hit save, we should be able to see that card come in. And once it's loaded in, we could update it through the local state. And that's all working as expected. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you haven't already. It would help me out a ton. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or what you guys want to see next, and I'll see you in the next one.